My name is Mortada Mohammed. I'm president of the World Affairs Council of Austin and adjunct professor at St. Edward's University. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our monthly forum on global investment, finance, emerging markets, and geopolitical risk. These forums, as most of you all know, are co-hosted in partnership with the Kozmetsky Center of Excellence, St. Edward's University. And the primary focus of these forums is to explore opportunities and geopolitical risks for companies in our region in global emerging markets. So our focus for this month is Brazil. And why Brazil in particular? Brazil is the second largest economy in the Western Hemisphere, following the United States. And in 2018, Brazil was the United States' second largest trading partner. Most recent data shows that the US exported over $66 billion in goods and services to Brazil. Before I turn the session over to our panel moderator, Mr. Brown, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our World Affairs Council of Austin members, St. Edward's University students and faculty, our Austin community businesses, as well as many World Affairs Council members from councils across the United States. Also, I must also give a special recognition to Dr. Cheryl Cross, Director, Kozmetsky Center of Excellence at Edwards University, and our co-host for these forums. Before we begin, just a bit of instructions. We'll keep all our questions for after the presentations. Please post them in the chat, and our senior intern, Rania Lewis, will gather your questions for the panel and relay them to Mr. Brown. Our panel today includes Ms. Valerie Belon, Economic Counselor and a Senior Foreign Service Officer. She has been with the State Department since January 1991, and prior to coming to Brazil in August 2018, she served for 2 years as State Department faculty chair at the Eisenhower School at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., where she taught graduate level microeconomics and industry analysis. Also joining the panel today, Mr. Joel Reynoso serves as the U.S. Embassy in Brazil as Deputy Senior Commercial Officer and Counselor for Commercial Affairs. Previously, Mr. Reynoso served as Commercial Officer and Digital Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Paris. And as Commercial Officer in Paris, he led a team of commercial specialists that counsels U.S. companies on doing business in France in industries such as aerospace, advanced manufacturing, and cybersecurity. Very much relevant to our region here. Mr. Greg Meier is an economic officer in Embassy Brazil, in our U.S. Embassy in Brazil, covering primarily the energy and natural resources portfolios. Greg has also served in economic roles in Karachi, Budapest, and back in D.C. Scott Miller currently serves as a trade and investment officer at U.S. Embassy in Brazil. He coordinated trade policy within the embassy between USTR, Commerce, and Agriculture to advance mission objectives under the reinvigorated Agreement on Trade and Economic Cooperation Framework. Ms. Martiza Navarrete, Economic Officer, U.S. Embassy in Brazil. Martiza Navarrete currently serves as an economic officer for the U.S. Department of State in our U.S. Embassy in Brazil. She covers digital economy, telecommunication, and intellectual property protection issues. And now, I'm honored to introduce Mr. Ian Brown, Political Officer of the U.S. Embassy in Brazil, who is serving as our moderator today. Mr. Brown is a career member of the United States Foreign Service and currently serving in U.S. Embassy in Brazil. He held prior posts in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, San Salvador, Port Louis, Mauritius, and Washington, D.C. As a diplomat in Latin America and Africa, Ian has served as a lead observer for a historic presidential election as well as managed efforts to strengthen trade and energy ties, to combat immigration fraud, and to broker security dialogues with Brazil, European Union nations, and China. Ian, it's over to you. Thank you.
Well, Martiza, thank you so much. Rania, thank you for all your help in getting us organized for today. Thanks to the World Affairs Council, of course, and the Kozmetsky Center at St. Edward's. Martiza, can we ask first, get an idea of who all is joining us today, a little bit more about our audience?
Sure. The business community in Austin, the student and faculty of St. Edward's University, and members from other councils across the United States.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
So if I may, Ian, just elaborate a little bit.
Sure, please.
The business community in Austin, you know, it's the high-tech industry, the energy, renewable energy, and the all the stuff that you're all bringing to the table today. So we're very much delighted, really delighted to have you all over today for that wonderful discussion. We have large audience attending actually today. See the number over 30 here. Okay, go ahead.
I see that. That's great. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us today. As Martiza mentioned, my name is Ian Brown, and I'm from Austin originally. So it's a real honor and pleasure to support Austin's efforts to showcase our growing international reach, and of course, our role within Texas and the country as a globally minded city. I'm a Foreign Service Officer in our political section here at our embassy in Brasilia, Brazil. And since this talk is focused on economic and market issues, as Martiza had mentioned, I knew as soon as Martiza reached out with an invitation to the event that I was not at all the ideal speaker for this talk. But I'm very fortunate to be joined by my very distinguished colleagues from our economic and foreign commercial sections here at the embassy. Thank you, Martiza, for the wonderful introductions. And of course, thank you again to my colleagues for joining today. We truly have excellent speakers lined up who are going to be talking on a number of issues that I think will interest you all, particularly because we are well aware that we are competing with your interest for updates on today's elections. So we will do our best to keep you engaged. So very quickly, let me give you a run of show of our presentations today before I turn it over to our economic counselor. First, our economic counselor, Valerie Belon, will give an introduction on the U.S. Foreign Service, our role in economic affairs and economic diplomacy. And then she'll turn it over to Martiza Navarrete, who is our digital economy officer, who will talk a little bit about the digital economy and tech sector here in Brazil. Then to Greg Meier, who's our energy officer, who can talk all things energy. Then over to Scott Miller, who's our trade and investment officer, and can give you a good overview of trade and investment issues here in Brazil. And then finally over to Joel Reynoso, who's our deputy senior commercial officer, who's based in Sao Paulo. And Joel can, of course, speak to the commercial landscape here in Brazil and the work that the Foreign Commercial Service does as part of our overall mission efforts. So without further ado, I will gladly turn the floor over to Valerie to kick us off. Valerie, thank you.
Great, thank you. And thanks to the organizers of this event. Look forward to it very much. As was said during one of my introductions, I've been with the State Department for nearly 30 years. In January will be my 30-year anniversary, so I'm the dinosaur of the group. Obviously, I joined very young, but yeah, the Foreign Service has actually changed quite a bit over the 30 years that I've been a part of it. We have a lot, we better represent the United States in terms of women and minorities. Still have a ways to go, but in our recruitment efforts, we definitely seek to get a broad array of representation from all backgrounds from the United States. And so, this is an opportunity for us to also do recruiting. And I want particularly all the students out there to think about taking the Foreign Service exam. We give the exam at least once, sometimes twice a year. And I don't think we charge anything for it, so you can take it often until you pass. But it's a great career. Working for the government is rewarding in that, you're working for a greater good. We're also fairly well compensated, and a lot of benefits when we're overseas. Housing is included, and they take care of education for our children, pay all of our moving expenses. So it's a lifestyle that's not for everyone. Moving every 2 or 3 years is disruptive, but I certainly have enjoyed it over the years. I'm going to actually give a very general overview of the State Department, because there's not a good understanding generally out there. I think people from the World Affairs Councils are familiar with the State Department, but how we rate in terms of budget and resources compared to say the Defense Department is not well understood generally. So I did send my presentation ahead of time. Did anyone get it? And can you go ahead and put it up on the screen?
Yes, it's in the works now.
Great, thank you. Now that's Joel's. That's mine. There you go. Okay. So as I said, my name is Valerie Belon. I'm the economic counselor here in the Brasilia, but covering the whole country. We have 4 consulates, the largest of which is in Sao Paulo, also a very large consulate in Rio, and 2 smaller consulates, one in Porto Alegre in the south and one Recife in the northeast. We also have a very small branch office in Belo Horizonte in Minas Gerais, which is just, how would you say, southeast of here. Next slide, please. So what is the State Department? What do we do? I mean, most people think they have an understanding of what the State Department do, but truly, what is the vision and the mission of the State Department? So I took these directly from state.gov, our website. The vision is that we promote and demonstrate democratic values to advance a free, peaceful, and prosperous world. So when we do our integrated country strategies, we do focus on those 3 areas: promoting democratic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and we also promote peace. I think the military is the last resort. If we end up going to war, it's because the State Department wasn't successful in doing our job. So there's a lot of tools that we can use short of using the military to find a peaceful solution. And then what we focus in the economic and commercial area is promoting shared prosperity. So that's the vision. So what's the mission? This Department of State leads America's foreign policy. And a lot of times at embassies, we have many, many different agencies represented. Just here today, you're hearing from not just State Department, but also the US Department of Commerce. Joel's in our Foreign Commercial Service. But here at the embassy, we have people from the Treasury Department, Department of Defense, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Health and Human Services, the Center for Disease Control, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the FBI. I mean, we have the whole alphabet soup of agencies represented because this is a very large mission, and almost every agency has some interest in Brazil. Not every US government agency is represented, but the large ones, most all of the large ones do have people here. So the State Department is focused on foreign policy through diplomacy, advocacy, assistance by advancing the interests of the American people, their safety and economic prosperity. And again, our main focus is economic prosperity. So, there's an important difference between hard power and soft power. Again, the military is, has the hard power designed to deter and tackle immediate threats. But in the State Department, we focus on using the tools of soft power, working with partners and allies on medium-term and even long-term threats. George Kennan's famous containment, today's non-proliferation, North Korea, Iran, also climate change, not a near-term threat, but a medium and long-term threat, existential threat, some would say, especially if you live in South Florida or if you're on the Gulf Coast. Countering violent extremism is another example, promoting democracy and human rights. So we foster conditions for stability and progress everywhere, and writing and for economic prosperity, trying helping other countries also be prosperous under the theory that a rising tide floats all boats. So we want not only prosperity in the United States, but our partners, allies, and in many ways, they're also our customers. So their economic growth helps us. Next slide, please. So this is an org chart of the State Department. You probably can't read a lot of that. It's very detailed, but just to give you a very broad idea, the areas we cover, Undersecretary for Political Affairs has all the regional bureaus, including ours, which is the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau. And then you have the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. He's actually coming to visit Brazil next week, along with the number 2 at the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau and the Assistant Secretary for Energy Affairs. But E, as we call him, covers not just economic affairs, but also our Energy Resource Bureau and the Environmental Affairs Bureau and Scientific Cooperation as well. And then we have the T family, that's arms control, international security. Part of this used to be an independent agency called ACTA, but again, that shows I'm a dinosaur, but it was merged back with the State Department. So all of the arms control negotiations are done there, non-proliferation work, political military affairs as well. And then we have the R family of bureaus. This is education and cultural exchanges, public affairs, public relations type of things, all of our press officers, embassy spokespeople, the department spokesperson, all fall under the R Bureau. And then the M family, that's a huge area, everything from kind of budget and finance to diplomatic security, medical. We have actually doctors, nurse practitioners, and physician's assistants posted overseas, monitoring and assisting with the health and welfare of embassy employees around the world. And every year we have a number that have to be medically evacuated because they fall ill while serving overseas, for instance. Also, all of our facilities, personnel, now they call it global talent management, payroll. It's basically the chief operating officer of the State Department is M. And then last but not least, we have the undersecretary for, what is that? Civilian security, democracy, and human rights. So that has our International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, also our Conflict and Stabilization Bureau, Countering Violent Extremism, Human Rights, Labor Affairs, kind of a mix of global issues in that bureau. So next slide, please. So if you'll see, what we do falls into those same neat categories where if you join the Foreign Service, you are put into one of 5 cones. And the cones are political affairs, economic affairs, management, consular, or public diplomacy. So the first 3 areas, the first 3 undersecretaries that I just named, all focus primarily on political affairs. And sometimes, an economic officer or management officer still might serve in those bureaus or in those functions. But political officers tend to, political affairs tends to be what you traditionally think of as diplomacy. And they also dominate in the arms control, international security, as well as civilian security and democracy. And then you have economic officers, like I have been for the past 30 years of my career, focused on not just economics, but also labor issues, sometimes energy issues, environmental, science and technology issues. Management officers are very important to any embassy. Again, a management officer is like the chief operating officer of the embassy. We have our management officer or what do you call it? Minister counselor for management affairs, handles HR, global talent management, it's a new name, budget, facilities, IT, diplomatic security, med. And then consular officers does American citizen services, passports, immigrant visas, and non-immigrant visas. So if you are traveling overseas and you get mugged, or you end up in the hospital and you have to negotiate your hospital bill or something like that, you might actually have to ask them to call the embassy, and our American Citizen Services department will help you. And last but not least, public diplomacy. These are the people that organize all of our cultural exchange programs, from Fulbright to the short-term international visitor leadership program. But also they do public affairs, so our press officers and press briefings are organized by public affairs. So if you are thinking about joining the State Department as a Foreign Service officer, you have to think about which cone interests you most. And they all have their pros and cons. But people tend to gravitate to say they want to be political officers because that's the people that do kind of what you think of as diplomacy. But I would argue that the economic cone is just as interesting. Management cone is extremely important. Consular cone, they get a lot out of helping Americans overseas, and public diplomacy cone is also extremely important. So there's a lot of options out there. Next slide, please. So the State Department, our budget is primarily payroll, is paying people. The State Department is people. We don't have aircraft carriers. We don't have missiles or weaponry. We have people. People is our toolkit. So how many people are we talking about? Well, more than half of us, half of the State Department are locally engaged staff. These are Brazilians working here at the embassy, either as drivers or as economic specialists, or agricultural specialists, or mechanics, carpenters, you name it. We always have more locally engaged staff than we do Americans. They know how to get things done locally. They're usually a lot more affordable than an American overseas that you have to house and pay American level salaries. And we couldn't run embassies without them. And then back at home, we have a lot of civil service officers. So not everybody who joins the State Department serves overseas. We rely on the civil service as our institutional knowledge back at headquarters. And when it comes to foreign service officers and specialists, there's only 13,000 of us. And if you only look at foreign service officers, there's actually fewer foreign service officers than there are kind of commissary and PX workers in military bases overseas and in the US. There's fewer foreign service officers than DoD musicians. I could come up with all sorts of statistics, but just to give you an idea of how small we are. I mean, there are millions of workers in the federal government, and only 13,000 of those are foreign service officers and specialists. So in terms of how many are overseas and how many are back home in the US, there's more in the US than overseas. There's only 9,000 Americans overseas at any given time, and there's 15,000 in the US. So a lot of foreign service officers spend a good chunk of their career in Washington, back at headquarters. And we're not great. I've always counseled people, you need to go back to headquarters every 5 to 8 years to understand how headquarters works so that you could be more effective overseas. So typically we spend about a third of our careers back in Washington. Next slide, please. So, people think of diplomats as, we're on the cocktail circuit wearing pinstripe suits all the time. That's also a myth. A lot of us have served in harm's way, in a hardship posting, or even in war zones. For a while, I'm not sure if it's still true, but our largest embassies were in Kabul and in Afghanistan. The people pictured here, you might recognize Chris Stevens, Ambassador Chris Stevens, who of course was killed in Benghazi, but he's one of actually many. Next to him is a photo of Anne Smedinghoff, who was part of a delegation accompanying the governor of Zabul province in Afghanistan to inaugurate a new school in Kalat, the provincial capital, while on a mission to help deliver donated books. She was killed by a suicide car bomber in Afghanistan in 2013. In 2008, an American diplomat and humanitarian aid officer, John Gravel, was shot to death at his car in Khartoum, Sudan. In 2006, David Foy, a facilities maintenance officer at the US consulate in Karachi, Pakistan, was killed by a suicide bomber. The US ambassador to Afghanistan, Adolf Dubs, was killed in an exchange of gunfire after a kidnapping attempt by Islamic terrorists in 1979, and he wasn't replaced until 2002, after we invaded Afghanistan more than 20 years later. 7 US ambassadors have been killed in the line of duty, including 5 by terrorist attack. So more ambassadors have been killed in the line of duty than generals in the Department of Defense. Next slide, please. So to kind of give you a perspective of, again, resources for the State Department as opposed to other branches of the US government. This is total federal spending. And you'll see that little, dark green sliver. That's the combined budget for the US State Department, USAID, all the foreign affairs agencies, Foreign Commercial Service, I believe, is in there as well. And this is, I'm sorry, I couldn't find a more recent slide, but it's, proportionally, it's still about the same. In fact, I think the military's green triangle is even bigger now. But yeah, the international affairs budget makes up less than 1% of the total US federal spending. Next slide, please. So if you look just at discretionary spending, so you take out Medicare, Medicaid, all the healthcare spending, and Social Security, still the military takes up more than half of discretionary spending, and the slice for international affairs is now 4% if you don't count mandatory entitlement spending. So I think, next slide, please. I'm going to finish there with this quote that, the best arguments for increased State Department funding typically come from DOD. And I particularly like this quote from General Mattis: if you don't fund the State Department fully, then he needs to buy a lot more ammunition. Because as I said, if we don't do our job, the last resort is the Defense Department, and we certainly don't want that. So I didn't talk much about Brazil. I'll just kind of summarize my comments about Brazil. You can delete the slideshow now. Just say, you mentioned, I think it was exports. Our two-way trade with Brazil totals, or let's say pre-pandemic, was over $100 billion a year in two-way trade. We're looking to try to double that within the next 5 years. And as a proportion of the economy, I think we can do that because Brazil trade as a with the US as a proportion of kind of the GDP is much smaller than countries like Colombia or Peru. Brazil's typically had a pretty closed economy for trade, and slowly it's opening. So I really think that that's achievable, to double this two-way trade from 100 billion to 200 billion within the next 5 years. We recently signed a new trade protocol with Brazil focused on non-tariff areas, including trade facilitation, kind of customs treatment, and kind of easing the flow of goods, also good regulatory practices, introducing, mandatory public comment periods for regulations, and also anti-corruption measures. So it's not, it might not sound as sexy or as interesting as a big free trade agreement where you lower tariffs, but in many ways, I'm very confident that it's even more important to the actual businesses on the ground, including Brazilian businesses, the ease of doing business, getting things through customs, getting necessary services or machinery to expand your business, very important, and minimizing red tape and regulations. So next you're going to hear from our knowledge economy officer. Marissa is a first tour officer, but doing outstanding work. In fact, she's the lead. She's going to have to jump off, or if she didn't already, she already had to jump off. So maybe we'll skip right to Greg. Marissa is the lead. I'm sorry?
I'm still here. I can give a quick brief on my sector before I head over to.
Okay, well, we don't want you to be too late, so you can give a super quick brief and then hand it over to Greg.
No, and I do want to apologize for everyone on the call for having to log off a little bit early. Having this visit next week, it entails all these last minute meetings to plan our events and meetings. But like Valerie said, I'm the digital economy officer in Brasilia for the econ section. I work a lot on telecom and IP issues as well. And I was hoping to start off just my brief on the digital economy sector with facts on 3 topics. And I hope that those 3 topics give you an idea of some of the opportunities, but also challenges in the digital economy sector. So I'll start off by saying that Brazil has some of the most avid digital consumers globally. So by sheer numbers, Brazil ranks number 2 for WhatsApp, number 2 for Instagram, number 3 for Facebook, LinkedIn, so forth and so on. And that's primarily because it's a very large market and has a huge population. But here you can't live your daily life in Brazil without having a WhatsApp. You use it for everything. So it is a big part of daily life here. But at the same time, we see things like Brazil really lagging on e-commerce. So I have some numbers here that I'm sure have changed because of the pandemic, but I'll say them just so you guys have a comparison. So for example, 6% of total retail sales in Brazil are made through e-commerce versus 20% in China and 12% in the US. Again, those numbers have probably increased because of the new reality, but I think it gives you an idea of how much room to grow there is on e-commerce. I also wanted to note startups. Brazil's overall startup ecosystem is growing at a really accelerated pace. We have over 10,000 startups, 46% of which are less than 2 years old. Sorry, I thought I lost the connection there for a second. And venture capital investments in Brazil amounted to 1.3 billion in 2018. So that accounts for 66% of all investments in Latin America. But yet, and Valerie alluded to this in her presentation, the ease of doing business in Brazil is not quite where we would like it to be. Brazil ranks 109th in ease of doing business globally. And for example, it takes 79 days on average to open up a company in Brazil. So there's still a lot of work to be done there in terms of fostering innovation and allowing for new businesses to emerge in the country. And I'll end with connectivity. So this is where we see the biggest divide between the Brazil in mega cities like Sao Paulo and Rio and rural Brazil. So you'll see statistics like 2/3 of Brazilians have smartphones, and spend on average 9 hours connected to the internet. That's in comparison to 6 hours for the US. But we still know that about 20% of Brazilians have never used the internet. And again, that mostly affects rural areas and low-income folks here in Brazil. So there's still a lot of improvement to be done there. And as you increase connectivity, of course, you increase opportunities for US businesses. So that's become a goal for us. So I talked about startups, ease of doing business, connectivity, the average Brazilian consumer in the digital economy sector. But what does that mean for us and for our priorities in the section? And I think I can summarize that by looking at 2 buckets. So first, we want to ensure that the regulation that we see coming out of Brazil, fosters innovation. It allows for U.S. companies to, have predictable regulation that they can easily abide to. So one big example of a priority area for us is Brazil's data protection law. It was published about 2 years ago. Since then, it's lost a lot of momentum when it comes to actually implementing that law. So one of the priority items that we've had, and when I say us, I mean our section in the econ section in Brasilia, but we also work on these issues across the mission. We have consulate officers, commercial and econ officers working in the consulates. I myself work a lot with the Department of Commerce here in Brasilia. But going back to data protection, a big piece that's missing here in Brazil is the Data Protection Authority. And Brazil's been very slow about building that up. And that's worried a lot of companies in general, including US companies. And it affects more than just the digital economy sector. So meeting with the Brazilians, making sure that this is an agenda item that they're prioritizing, that they're choosing good technical people to lead this data protection authority has been a big priority. And I'll end by saying that the second bucket we focus a lot on is increasing connectivity, but at the same time ensuring trust. So, for example, we launched this initiative in the Western Hemisphere called the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership. Under this initiative, which we've launched in other parts of the world, but is fairly new in the Western Hemisphere, we're looking at how do we increase capacity building efforts in Brazil when it comes to connectivity, internet access, but also cybersecurity capacity. And as we're rolling that initiative out, we're looking at what trainings can we offer, what technical exchanges can we facilitate between our subject matter experts and the ones here in Brazil. And that's been a priority for us as well. Under that same bucket of ensuring trust, another priority issue for the section has been the security of future telecom networks. So when we're looking at 5G and the vendors that will build out that infrastructure, we're concerned about what we call untrusted vendors. So companies that don't have a transparent ownership structure, have links to foreign governments like China, or have a very public track record of illegal behavior. And so as we talk to the Brazilians, that's been a big agenda item for us, is focusing on securing these future communication networks and also just ensuring the health of this sector. Because when you look at the vendors that are available to build out 5G, you're looking at a very concentrated market with one player, often engaging in anti-competitive practices. So I do have to log off. I'm sorry, but if you have any questions, I'm sure folks on the line can either relay those to me or answer them on my behalf. But I'll end by just saying that Valerie said it's my first post and it's been really fun so far. Couldn't have asked for a better portfolio. All right, Ian, I think I'm turning it over to you now.
Yes, Martiza, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you could stay with us, if only for a few minutes, because you do cover such important issues, particular to our Austin and Texas audience here. So thank you, Martiza. Bye. Greg, I can turn it over to you next.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am Greg Meier. I work with Martiza and with Valerie, with Scott in our economic office. I'm what's called a mid-level economic officer. I've been in the State Department for about 10 years now, mostly working on economic issues. Prior to Brazil, as was mentioned earlier, I spent a year in Pakistan, before that in Budapest, Hungary, and then working on economic issues also in Washington. I would endorse Valerie's recommendation for working on economic issues. They are really quite fascinating and vary so much from one part of the world to another. I thought I would kind of just go over, what I focus on, both in terms of the type of work I have to do, and then what are the interesting issues in Brazil with regard to energy and natural resources. About half of what I do is it's almost like a research journalist. For my portfolio, of course, I follow the news. I engage with businesses that are working in the sector. I engage with different trade groups. I engage with government officials to research what's happening in the different areas of my portfolio. And then, periodically we'll write a report called a cable, which is just a summary of these observations, perhaps along with some policy recommendations that goes to a very tailored audience. Once I had a college professor, who I'm still in touch with, comment on how cool he thought that job was, because while we might not have a wide readership, it might get read by the Secretary of State. So it's certainly an important part of what we do here. And in the energy sector, I feel like I have, one of the most interesting portfolios in Brazil. There's just so much happening here. You don't usually think of Brazil as an energy powerhouse, but Brazil has been consistently growing their oil production year over year. And in about another 4 years, they're projected to be among the top 4 or 5 producers in the world. They would displace every country in the Middle East as a top producer, except for Saudi Arabia. That has big implications for the balance of powers and global politics. And as you might imagine, Exxon is here, Chevron is here. Big American interests are actively investing in Brazil. So it's our job to keep tabs on what's happening in terms of are the auctions for these assets fair, and are the auctions allowing U.S. firms to compete on a level playing field with other countries and other firms. Petrobras has been traditionally had an energy monopoly with their state energy company, Petrobras. What's happening with Petrobras now? They're diversifying and selling off a lot of their assets. Are there opportunities for U.S. firms to enter into the areas that Petrobras is exiting? You also might not know, Brazil is one of the largest producers of renewable energy in the world. Most of Brazil's power generation comes from hydroelectric dams. Second largest dam in the world is in Brazil, on the border with Paraguay. Brazil's a growing power for wind energy, for solar energy. So, a great export market for U.S. technology. But what sectors really are the best? Where should we be engaging with Brazil to help adapt their policy to make it more attractive for international investment in the renewable energy sector, for instance? These are the types of things that we'll focus on in reporting. Very specific questions that are useful for our policymakers back in Washington. One great example of this, was an idea that Valerie, my boss, gave me about a year ago. In the beginning of 2019, the White House released an initiative that established 35 minerals as critical minerals. These are minerals that are essential for the renewable energy industry. Lithium for batteries. There's a bunch of rare earth elements that go into renewable energy, into wind turbines, and create magnets for wind turbines, silicon that goes into solar panels. These were designated critical minerals and really essential for clean energy going forward. So Valerie suggested, well, Brazil's a big mining company. Why don't you look into what's happening in Brazil? And so, of course, we did that, and we wrote a cable on critical minerals. That ended up generating a lot of attention in Washington. It stimulated interagency discussions on how should we adapt our policy to Brazil with regard to critical minerals. And the result from that was, we're launching now a fairly significant technical assistance program to help Brazil develop their rare earth industry, their critical mineral industry, and attract more international investment. So sometimes from reporting and research, then comes policy, and that's really what we're trying to do here. The other half of my job is more directly facilitating and advocating for U.S. priorities with our different interlocutors in Brazil. And for an economic officer, our interlocutors are in the various economic ministries, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in professional industry groups, and then with the private sector. So I coordinate, for instance, a bilateral dialogue that we have on energy topics. It's called the U.S.-Brazil Economic Forum. And earlier this year, our Secretary of Energy came to Rio to work through a couple of days of meetings with our Brazilian counterparts as part of this forum. What does this forum try to do? In that visit to Rio, we signed a couple of agreements. The private sector signed a couple of agreements that facilitate cooperation in nuclear energy. Brazil is one of the few countries in the world that's really investing now in nuclear energy, and we are interested in having Westinghouse and other U.S. technologies take the lead in helping them develop that sector. Brazil's also reforming parts of their energy market. They're in the middle of creating legislation and rules for a new market for natural gas. Natural gas is currently dominated by Petrobras, the state company, and Brazil is trying to make it a competitive market. They're looking to the United States for examples of good regulation. Just this past week, under this U.S.-Brazil Energy Forum, we hosted a series of technical seminars with U.S. regulators from the Department of Energy, from various state utilities that shared their experience in creating a natural gas market in Brazil with Brazilian regulators, something that they really need help with since it's really not intuitive. Facilitating these types of engagements also often takes the role that Melissa is doing right now, which is planning for the visit of a high-level official. For a State Department officer, these are both very stressful and tiring tasks, but they're also really rewarding because often you'll be able to sit in the room when some kind of history is being made. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in Melissa's role facilitating the visit of our National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. And he had a string of meetings in Sao Paulo and in Brazil. It takes so much planning, to get everything just right. But then at the end of the day, both Valerie and I were in the same room when our U.S. Exim Bank signed a contract with the Ministry of Economy promoting investment in U.S. exports to Brazil. That was announced to press. President Bolsonaro was there. Our National Security Advisor was there. A whole group of ministers and elite government policymakers were there for this, for making official this great achievement. So that's also its own reward to be able to be behind the scenes facilitating this type of diplomacy and advance in our bilateral relationship. I would encourage anyone interested in, like Valerie, in considering this as a career. It's a second career for me. My first career was in the technology sector, and making the jump into the Foreign Service has just been a plus for me. Happy to answer any questions after the rest of us present. Back to you, Ian.
Fantastic. Joel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I do have a presentation, so I think it was sent over. Someone can put it up, but in the meantime, I'll just introduce myself. Yeah, Joel Reynoso. I'm with the Foreign Commercial Service, which is a different agency At the beginning of the presentation, Valerie mentioned that there are a number of agencies, government agencies overseas, and we are one of many. Foreign Commercial Service has a smaller footprint than state. We are about a total of 250 officers. And we tend to be in the larger markets, the markets where US companies have more ability to sell their products and services. As a mission, we are very focused on helping US companies do business abroad, both large and small companies, although I would say we spend a large percentage of our resources with smaller to medium size, which we consider those with 500 employees or less. And the reason, of course, is because those companies don't tend to have offices overseas. They cannot afford the large consultants. So that's where we come in as a government agency. And we have about 100 offices in the US, including one in Austin. So if you haven't heard of us before, you can type in export.gov and you can find your nearest office. My presentation is more focused on what's going on in the Brazilian economy. We do these presentations often more for companies who are considering what are the potential opportunities to sell products and services into the Brazilian market. We work very closely with our economic colleagues, so Valerie, Martiza, all of them really. We're a staff of about 45 in Brazil, and we also divide our staff by industry sector. So we'll have staff working with Martiza on the digital side, with Greg on the oil and gas and on the renewable energy side, and so on and so forth. I am the head of the Sao Paulo office, which is, of course, the largest office. This is where the business capital of Brazil is. So why don't we go to the next slide, where it does also show where we are. And this kind of mirrors the footprint of the State Department and our mission in Brazil. We have 5 offices. By far, even though these are 5, about half the staff are in Sao Paulo. This is where most US companies are headquartered, and where companies based in the US will find their business partners, if they're distributors or agents and so forth. And the rest of the country is divided between those offices. I think the next slide has a nice map, which we like to show, because you guys are in a different special category course. You know a lot about Brazil, but most Americans don't realize that Brazil is about the size of mainland US, right? So it's a pretty large country. However, the geography is different in terms of where people live and where businesses happen, where we in the US tend to have a lot of business hubs from the West Coast to Chicago to Austin and Houston and so forth. A lot of the business in Brazil, and again, I'm talking to you as if you're, a potential US company doing business here, you're going to find your partners in the southeast of the country, primarily in the cities of Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte, but of course, by far, Sao Paulo. And just to give you an impression of how large the market is, even in Sao Paulo, that the state of Sao Paulo, which is one of 26 states, 27 states if you count the capital, is larger than the economy of the state of Sao Paulo is larger than the economies of Argentina, Uruguay, and Bolivia put together, right? So they're just kind of giant in terms of economic powerhouse. Brazil is, but more specifically the southeast of the country, which is, there are 2 states below us where you see sort of it jutting out, but then Sao Paulo's right around there. So it's a massive country and massive opportunities. And that's why we have such a large FCF staff here. Some of the statistics on the left are a little bit outdated. The growth in the GDP, of course, is down because of the coronavirus and the recession. That number switches. I've seen something like 5% and jumping up past 7%. So it's still to be determined. But in many cases, Brazil is still a difficult market to get into for U.S. companies. If you switch over to the next slide, one more slide, please. Yeah, here we go. Um, it's a large market. There are a lot of opportunities, but it's a still difficult market. And I think Valerie and Martiza kind of mentioned a few times how some of the rankings in terms of ease of doing business, it still ranks pretty low. It's doing much better, but it still ranks low in many areas. There's still many import tariffs that U.S. exporters have to watch out for when they're exporting their goods to the Brazilian market. Another issue that's going on because of COVID, it's caused another recession in Brazil. Brazil went through a recession 2014 through 2016. They changed their government, things were looking better, and then COVID hit. So they're in another recession. That's caused something else to happen that makes it difficult for our exporters, which is the US dollar exchange rate. And this graph here, you can see, by the way, I came to Brazil 2012 for my first tour. And so there, the exchange rate was 1.6 to the dollar, which was actually great for our companies who are trying to sell their products into Brazil. For us living in Brazil, everything was super expensive. So it was a kind of a hard time for us as diplomats here. But you can see through the years ending in 2020, now we're up to around 5.5, 5.6 for the US dollar. So that means our goods and services are expensive for Brazil. Now, it means that any imported products are expensive, even coming from the EU or the UK. But as US companies do business here, it's something that they have to be aware of, that at this very moment, our goods and services are very expensive, right? However, I would say that I'm still optimistic about opportunities for US company, because if you're thinking this is a short-term problem, right? This should change as things get better in 2021. And what we're seeing and why I'm pretty optimistic for US companies is the administration here has been making a number of changes to their economy, to the macroeconomic agenda, designed to make it easier for foreign investors, foreign companies, including US companies, to do business here. Some of them are smaller changes. Some of them are more interesting. There's a huge privatization effort going now, where the Bolsonaro administration is privatizing ports and airports and sanitation and sewage. That's presenting a lot of good opportunities for our companies. So we're pretty optimistic. If we go to the next slide, I think there's some other kind of concern that we have, and this is more long-term. This is the Custo Brasil, which is companies who don't know Brazil, US exporters, US firms, have to contend with this issue. This is sort of the bureaucracy. There's still some corruption issues here going on. It's getting much better. The tariffs, the taxes, all of that, what the Bolsonaro administration is trying to improve. But compared to other markets, for example, like a Canada or Mexico, it tends to be a little bit of a harder nut to crack for our US companies, especially our smaller to medium-sized companies. We like to say if you haven't yet exported as a US company, then there may be an easier market to start, especially for countries where we have free trade agreements like Mexico. Okay. However, as Valerie also mentioned, we have a new protocol with Brazil that was signed recently. We do believe that although that's not perhaps making these splashy announcements in the US in terms of front page news, there are some really good benefits there for our companies around mutual recognition of certifications, around things related to customs, recognizing each other's paperwork, intellectual property rights are more protected. things that really do matter for our US exporters and things that our companies have been asking for a very long time. Next slide, please. Next slide, I'll just skip over this. I think Valerie mentioned this. So see, these are some of the things that have happened since 2019. You may know that our presidents currently have a very strong relationship that's allowed us to do a number of things that we haven't in the past through dialogues. We have commercial dialogues, we have a defense dialogue with Brazil. There have been some visits, all leading up to this recent signing of this protocol, which is also really a one step in the potential signing of further trade agreements that make it easier for both sides to do business. You know, I've been in Brazil or following Brazil for over 10 years now. And I have to say that coming back, I just been here since August. I do see a lot of positive changes in the country for the private sector, even though we're in this odd place where there's a recession, there's coronavirus, but the changes are great. And I am optimistic that, as Valerie mentioned, our trade will increase and potentially even double over the next 5 years. So I'm going to stop there since we're past 4 o'clock, past the hour. Thank you.
Thanks again for a wonderful session. A lot of us really feel updated on the different functions the State Department does and the commercial offices as well. And I'm sure the audience enjoyed that. I have a few questions, really. The first one, I would say, regarding the COVID-19, I know the Department of Commerce usually have services like Gold Key services and things in that nature, connecting U.S. exporters with potential clients overseas, and of course, in Brazil as well. And then trade shows and this kind of activities, are they on hold because of COVID-19? Are you doing them virtual? So that is my number one question, and until we get others and so forth, and have some more for you.
Good question, Professor. Yes, they're not on hold, but as you can imagine, a lot of them turned virtual. So we're still doing our core work of matching U.S. companies with potential partners in Brazil. Instead of them happening in person, most of those are happening over something like this, right? A Zoom call or a MS Teams conference call or WebEx. So we're still very much in operation. Brazilians cannot travel to the US, so some of that's not happening, and Americans are being very cautious as well. So we're still in operation, but more in a virtual mode. Thanks.
Sure. Rania, I think there is a question from the chat. Yeah? You want to relate to the panel?
Yes, so we have a couple of questions lined up for y'all. So our first question is for Valerie, but again, feel free to chime in. The question reads, how much would you say climate protection measures will impact Brazilian economy, especially in the Amazon rainforest?
That's really hard to measure. We are working in partnership with Brazil quite a bit on forest fire, kind of firefighting, as well as prevention and just general deforestation. Most of our USAID budget is focused in the Amazon, including they put in, I can't remember exactly how much, $5 or $10 million as seed funding for a new investment fund for sustainable investments in the Amazon to encourage things like Brazil nut harvesting, or you know, things that are you know, forest friendly things, to even ecotourism, things that can give value to the forest for the local populations. We also have our U.S. Forest Service has come down and given trainings. We assisted last season, and I'm not sure about this season, with training and equipment to fight the fires. This year in the Amazon, it's roughly the same as last year, maybe even a little bit less. But the fire is much worse in another region called the Pantanal, which is one of the world's largest wetlands. And that area has been hit really hard by forest fires this year. So I think, the protection of forests in Brazil is important globally, but it's also important for Brazil. I mean, they want to make sustainable use and in ways that helps them with overall economic growth, particularly for populations that live in and around the rainforest. And so, it's something that you have to balance conservation with, ways to sustainably use the forest. And that gives value to it so people won't cut down the trees and do forest fires. So I think it's a partnership. And I think there are very strong non-governmental organizations and civil society focused on the environment in Brazil and working in partnership with global organizations. I think it has a potentially very large impact on Brazil's economy. It's not one of the pillars of Brazil's economy currently, but it certainly has the potential to be so in the future. I think in the future, countries that have access to large amounts of fresh water, that's going to be the next oil boom. It's going to be a freshwater boom. It's going to be more valuable than oil, I think, in the long-term future.
Thank you, Valerie. So our next question is in relation to Joel's presentation. What would you say are some of the corporate culture differences to be aware of when doing business in Brazil? And are they consistent from north to south?
Did you say corporate culture differences?
Correct.
Corporate culture. Good question. Yeah. I would say that there are. On average, the Brazilians tend to be more formal than we are. That means not only in how they dress, right? I would say that wearing a suit is pretty much mandatory if you're going to meet with either the private sector or government. But there also tend to be a bit hierarchical. So you have to be aware of protocol. They tend to work through assistance, and you have to kind of pay attention to who's who in the hierarchy. Definitely in the government world, but I also see it in the private sector. My colleagues would probably, well, I guess we're talking about the business world. So yeah, that's what I've noticed in my dealings with the Brazilian private sector. They're very respectful and admirable of US companies or culture. They're much more aware of what's happening in the US than vice versa. So they'll tend to know the trends and things going on. So the conversations are, pretty sophisticated. Sometimes we have to remind our American companies, that they should kind of brush up on what's going on in the Brazilian business world, because I think sometimes Americans have an impression of a third world country. They see a lot of stories of crime and security in the Amazon, and they tend to be quite surprised to see the sophistication of cities like Brasilia and Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So that's the short answer I would give. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Our next question is a more general question. When do you all expect the next round of funding to be released for grant cycle in the public affairs section?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have anybody here with the public affairs section, so that's a difficult question to answer. And I'm not sure what kind of grant funding you're talking about. Are you talking about like Fulbrights or, yeah, I'm not sure what I mean, because the public affairs section does a lot of the managing of exchange programs, including the Fulbright program. So I don't believe the funding hasn't changed, but a lot of the programs that require international travel have been suspended during the pandemic. So some things are going forward virtually, but there hasn't been a suspension of the funding itself. It's just that travel has been, the travel restrictions have gotten in the way of doing some specific exchanges. Sorry, I can't answer more fully, not being with the public affairs section.
No worries. I think you're able to touch on some good spots. Our next question is actually from Dr. Cross. She would love to hear more about some of the internship opportunities that you have for university students or even recent graduates.
Yeah, I put in the chat a link to the section we have that gives kind of full information on internships and opportunities for students. Unfortunately, our internships, at least overseas, have been suspended because of the pandemic. We do have a virtual internship program that students can apply for. And even though our regular internship program has been suspended for now, as soon as we can, we'll reopen it. So, definitely look into that option and apply early because unfortunately with the State Department internships, they all require security clearances, which makes the process a lot longer. So you really have to apply basically a year ahead of time. And hopefully, a year from now, we won't be in the same situation with the pandemic and travel restrictions. So now actually would be a good time to apply. And most people don't realize that. So now would be a good time to apply because maybe there'd be less competition for the next, cohort of interns, whether it be next summer or in the fall. But I run our State Department internship programs in the economic section of a lot of the embassies I've worked in. They're great programs for students to get to know what the State Department really does, both overseas and in Washington, and get a better feel for it if they're thinking about possibly applying to join the Foreign Service or even be a civil servant in Washington. So, even if you're not sure, I would encourage you to think about just trying it through an internship program. And some, but not all, but many of our internship, particularly for students from low-income families, some internships are paid as well. Many aren't, but we do have some paid internship opportunities as well. And the internships are both in Washington and at embassies overseas. So if you already speak a language, you'd be a great candidate for an internship in, Brazil if you speak Portuguese, or, if you speak Ukrainian, you'd be a fantastic candidate for an internship in our embassy in Ukraine, for instance. So think about applying for an internship program. It really is a great program. Usually it's about 10 weeks long, and it can be during the summer, that's the most competitive because that's when most students are available. But, many times you can get college credit for or even graduate school credit for internships. So if you want to do it, say for a fall semester or spring semester, those are opportunities as well. It's a year-round program.
And to kind of lead off of that, what would you say would be a great next steps for our student audience who are interested in joining the Foreign Service?
Well, read up on the state.gov website. There's some great information for students and people that are thinking about taking the Foreign Service exam, what our hiring process is like, what the internship opportunities are. We also have different fellowships for minority students. They can enter through the Wrangell or the Pickering fellowship programs, because we really want to hire more minority foreign service officers. So yeah, just go to state.gov and start just looking around, and there's lots of information there.
Ryan?
Joel, I don't know if you wanted to make a plug for the Foreign Commercial Service and some of our other foreign service partners.
Yeah, ours is let's say we actually have the rare opportunity. I have the rare opportunity to announce that we are recruiting. We're such a small agency. I mentioned there's only about 250 commercial officers. Usually I'm on these presentations with my state colleagues and I'm kind of jealous because it's such a rare window, but it's open right now actually. So
Wow.
if you are interested at all in understanding what we do in the Department of Commerce, it's on USA Jobs. You can just Google it as well and you'll see the advertisement. I'm hesitant a little bit, Ian, because in our agency, they tend to value experience. So you don't see a lot of 22-year-old from commercial service officers because often they want our
Private sector experience.
right to go
Yeah.
first to the private sector, or you can be in the government, but that has something to do with international trade or marketing before you go into the foreign commercial service. So if you're that profile, if you've started a bit later, I encourage you to look at that announcement. But unfortunately, they tend to emphasize that experience. Now, I also agree with Valerie to go and look on these websites. I also tell people who are interested in taking the foreign service test, even if you're not sure you want to go overseas, just take it. It's if you can not stress out about it, it's actually a fun exercise to take because it challenges you in a way that a normal interview won't challenge you, right? You're using all sorts of different skill sets and communication skills and writing skills. So I've told folks like, okay, you don't really know where you're going to be in 2 or 3 years, but sometimes the process takes that long before you get an offer. And it may be that you're not that interested now, but you think in 10 years you will be. All of that experience of going through the examination process is just going to prepare you when you really want to or want to go overseas. So I encourage you, even if you're not ready to think, oh, I can never go overseas, or I want to first have a few years in the private sector or get married first, it's still a fun exercise to go through. I would encourage it.
If I may, I just want to back up that inquiry from Rania to assure you all that we have awesome students from Canadians and US. I know Ian is a UT grad, but Ian,
Yeah.
you're an Austinite afterwards. But we do have really students graduating that really know what the global market is like, what's about, and really ready to take the challenge, which is fantastic to see as one of the faculty in the school here and interacting with the students on almost everyday basis. Because of time and before we close our session, I want to ask Dr. Cross if Dr. Cross, if you want to share a few words or anything.
Yes, I'm just trying to turn my system back on, but
Okay.
thank you. That was a terrific panel, and I especially I think that the not only the giving us an overview of circumstances in Brazil, resources available for the private sector interested in business and promoting economic engagement in Brazil, but terrific suggestions for students that are interested in future careers. And to the students that are here, I really strongly encourage you to think seriously about internship opportunities with the State Department. That'll open all kinds of possibilities and give you some very valuable experience, whether you plan to go into policy or you're interested long-term in working with the private sector. So this has been a very dynamic panel and interesting opportunity for us to be able to host you here, Ian, and returning to your hometown of Austin. And with your colleagues. We really appreciate it. And Mortada, thank you. Terrific program. And I think this partnership between the Kozmetsky Center and World Affairs Council Austin will open up all kinds of possibilities for our community and for our students in the future. So I'm very grateful to you and to your team. And most of all, for this session today, I want to thank our senior intern, Rania Lewis, for the incredible work and professional organization. Terrific example of the quality of students and commitment of our students at St. Edward's University, and your efforts here are very much appreciated, Rania. So thanks to all, and stay safe there in Brazil, and we will see how things develop in the United States today with the elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cross, and I too thank Rania for all the help you give us for preparing this session and communicating with the speakers. Thank you all very much. It's been wonderful having you here, sharing your knowledge with our community, the business, and students. And Ian, stay in touch. Be safe, everybody. And thanks again, and we'll be in touch.
Certainly. Thank you all. Valerie, Joel, thank you so much. Mortada, Rania, thank you.